Now, one of the most important things to figure out using grid is how to size our columns and rows to conform to our design. If we start out with a grid container that has 4 grid items like this, and we go ahead and add some CSS, so we create some template rows and template columns, and in this case, we're defining the rows and columns by giving them fixed sizes. 100 pixel and 200 pixel rows, 400 and 800 pixel columns. So when we run this code, this is what we will end up with. We have 100 pixel high for the first row and 200 pixel high for the second row. For the first column, we said it would be 400, and the second column should be twice as wide at 800. The thing you have to realize about the fixed size grids like this one is they are not responsive. That means that if you go ahead and change the width or the height, it's not going to change at all. It's going to stay fixed to these sizes that you have specified. In addition to using pixels, we can also use rem. So you could use the 1 rem and then maybe 2 rem. Now this is still fixed because the rem sizing, as we learned in previous lessons, is relative to the root of your HTML. If your body has a certain size or your HTML has a certain size specified and you change that size, then the rem size will go up and down with it. But this does not make it responsive to the screen size. Now, another way you might see this being represented is instead of having grid template rows and grid template columns, is you can combine the two of these into one property, which is just called grid template. And you define all of your rows first, and then you add a /, and then you define your columns. So if you had a lot of grids to define, if you had a lot of things and you wanted this shorthand, this is how you would do it. I don't recommend us to write code like this at this stage, because I think it's much better when you're learning for everything to be more explicit, so that when you're reviewing your code and you're trying to spot problems, it's much easier when you've got the rows defined and your columns defined and you can see exactly what's going wrong. This just makes it a little bit more hidden as to what's going on, but it's really important for you to know this if you see it in the wild in other people's code, so you know what's going on. Another way that we can define our grid template rows and columns is to use this auto keyword. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to give us a little bit of responsiveness. Each row is going to try and fit to 100% of the horizontal available space. If this was your browser window, maybe it would look something like this, and then you've got your window size like this, then your grid is automatically going to try and take up 100% of that width. So now if you go ahead and define your first column as 200 pixels wide, like what we have here, and then you said the next column should be auto, what this means is the second column is going to be extensible. It can be as wide or as narrow as it needs in order to take up 100% of the width. Now be careful here, because if you do the same thing with the rows, it doesn't behave like what you might think it does. It doesn't try to take up 100% of your screen's height. Instead, what it does is it tries to fit to the content. If this is set, in this case it's 100 pixels, then that div is 100 pixels. Now this one, however, is not set in height, and it's just given to be auto. Now what that's going to do is it's just going to try and fit whatever content is in there. And in this case is this number 3. So as long as number 3 fits in there perfectly, then it will automatically adjust the height to fit that. So just be aware that when you use auto on a row, it's going to fit content. And when you use auto on a column, then it's going to try and go to 100%. This is another case where it's quite good to play around with an actual example. So I've created a demo website for you at appbaru.github.io/grid sizing. And here we've got a menu of different ways of sizing grid. You've seen the fixed size, where the grid is not responsive at all to the size of the screen. It doesn't matter how wide or how narrow it is. And then we've got the auto size that I showed you just now. This first column, as we said, has to be 200 pixels wide, but then the second column is set to auto. So it's shrinking as I'm shrinking my screen, and it's expanding as I expand my screen. But even though the second row is also set to auto, it only is high enough to fit the content, and it doesn't grow and shrink with the size of the screen. So have a play around with that and come back and we'll talk more about the next one, which is fractional sizing. Frequently, what you might want in your layout is to define the different areas of your layout with ratios for sizes. Maybe you would want the first row to be half the size of the second row, and maybe you would want your columns in the same way. This is where the fractional unit comes in with the FR, and this unit basically defines the ratios. If we run this code, this is what we would get. This first row is half the size of the second row, and similarly, this first column is half the size of the second column. You can, of course, go for any sort of fractions you want. You could have the first row be 1 FR and the second one be 2.5 FR, or you could have the first column be 3 FR and the second one be 5 FR, any sort of ratios you want, essentially. And what it's going to do is it's going to grow and shrink depending on the width available for the horizontal and also the content size for the vertical. Again, going back to our demo, if you take a look at the fractional size, you can see that no matter how much I shrink my screen, the first column is always going to try and stay half the size of the second column. And if I go ahead and select this and then inspect, and I add a whole bunch of content to this bit of HTML, so let's say instead of 3, I just add a whole bunch of text like this, then you can see that the first row expands as well, and it's all done just so that we maintain that fractional ratio, so that this one is always half the size of this one. So have a play around with this example, and then we'll talk about the min-max size. Sometimes you want to define how your grid is responsive, especially on the horizontal. One of the functions we can use is called min-max. And here we can define the minimum width and the maximum width we want our column to be. This is what it might look like. In this case, what we're saying is that when we have enough space on the horizontal, we want to give this second column more space. So it can go all the way up to 800 pixels and all the way down to 400 pixels wide. And this essentially sets a limit, because sometimes we have certain types of content, we don't want it to be too narrow, like an image, or we don't want it to be too wide because it might change the scaling. So this is another way of limiting the size of columns inside your grid. Right now, you can see that this second column here is 800 pixels wide from edge to edge. If I go ahead and reduce the size of this, so if I go ahead and make this window a little bit smaller, you'll see that second column being responsive, reducing in size until it will refuse. And that is because it's hit 400 pixels right here. We're essentially setting a stop at 400 pixels and another at 800 pixels to further define how we want our website to be responsive. Remember previously when we created our chessboard, we had to write 1FR, 1FR, 1FR 8 times, and that's a lot of repetition. And remember, we're programmers, so we're inherently lazy and we want to save ourselves work. We can do that in Grid by using the repeat function. So we're saying repeat this size this many times. This is how many times you want to repeat it, and this is the size. And similarly with our columns, we can do the same thing. What this is equivalent to is defining the rows as 200 pixels, space 200 pixels, and for our columns, this code is the same as saying 100 pixels, space 100 pixels. But we didn't have to write all of that out. And as you can imagine, if the repeat was 8 or 10 or 100, that's going to save you a lot of time. And as you would expect, this would create exactly the same layout as if you had defined the size of each column and each row. It works exactly the same. It's just time saving. Now, what if you defined a grid that is larger than you have items for? So here you can see in our HTML, we have 4 items, but here we're creating a 2x3 grid. So we have 2 rows and 3 columns. If we only have 4 items, they're fitted into our grid from the top left all the way to the bottom right. So that means once we've laid out the first row, it's going to double back and continue along the second row. But if we don't have any items for number 5 and number 6, then it's just not going to add them in there, and you have this style of layout. Now, what happens if you don't define enough rows and columns? So in this case, we're defining a 2x2 grid with each item being 200 pixels tall and wide. Now, I've added in a third div, item number 5. Because that doesn't fit within the templated row and column, which is only 2x2, so this is the defined template grid, well then anything that gets added afterwards will get an automatic size based on its height and also any existing column sizes. So it will try to match the previous column's width, but it will try to fit the height to the height of the content. If you want to change this, let's say you have some code that will create more divs in the future, or maybe you have a game that's going to add more squares, something like that, you can actually use the grid auto rows and grid auto columns to define this. So in this case, I'm saying when we create a new row that doesn't fit within our grid, because our grid actually ends here, then give each of them 300 pixels in height. And this just allows you to control your styling no matter how many items gets added to the grid. This is a good time to go back to our demo and click on the repeat title to see our repeated grid. As you might imagine, this is a very simple grid which is repeated by having 2 rows are 200 pixels each and 2 columns which are 100 pixels each. If I go ahead and change this so that I have 3 columns, then you can see we have that layout we had before where we've got some missing items, but it's only going to lay out as many items as we have in our HTML. Similarly, if I change this to only 1 column, then we've got some extra items that are not defined using our template rows and columns, which is a 2x1, so 2 rows, 1 column, and all these extra ones get an automatic size based on the size of their content. But we can of course change this by using that property we learned, which is grid auto rows. And if we set this to be, say, 300 pixels, then you can see every new automatically added item gets that particular height. Have a play around with this, and once you're done, I want you to come back and I want to talk more about how we can use the Chrome developer tools to investigate and debug our CSS grid. As you can imagine, as we're fiddling around with Flexbox or Grid, it can be quite hard to know exactly what's happening behind the scenes. So we're going to learn more about how we can use the Chrome developer tools to see exactly what's going on in our CSS grid. As you remember, you can bring up the Chrome developer tools either by right-click to go to Inspect, or simply to go to the three dots, go to More Tools, and then go to Developer Tools. It will do exactly the same thing, basically bring up this panel. One of the cool things that you'll see is when you have defined a grid, so this is when you set display grid onto a particular item in your HTML. In the Chrome developer tools, you see this little chip show up and it says grid. If you click on it, it will offer you a whole bunch of information, which is really handy. Now we can change the layout of the overlaid stuff by going into layout here. And you can see, for example, if I don't want to have a pink sort of outline, let me change this to black, then you can see it maybe a little bit more clearly. I can also change whether if we show each of the sizes of the columns and the rows, or if I want to extend the grid lines to see what's happening, or if I want to show the line numbers. I can basically show and hide all of these things. But normally by default, you'll see the line numbers and you'll see the sizes of the rows and the columns. Here, if we look at the first number, you can see that each of the columns are 100 pixels wide. And if we look at the first number for the second part, each of the rows are 200 pixels high. So now that we've learned how to size items in our CSS grid and use the Chrome developer tools to inspect and see exactly what's going on with our sizing, it's time for us to try an exercise. So I've created a grid sizing exercise in the website. And to access it, all you have to do is go back to the main menu of the grid sizing website and then go to the test page. You can see this is the grid that we want you to recreate. And I've added in the width and height requirements to most of them. There's just a couple of things to note, which is how this website responds when we resize it. If I go ahead and reduce the width, you can see that the first column will expand to fill the space and reduce until a certain point. Now, when I continue reducing the size, you can see that the third column will also start to reduce in size, but the second column stays that particular fixed size always. The other thing to note is that our final item here is only 50 pixels high, and it's actually even shorter than how much it should be allocated based on the content. So this is a grid item that's put in automatically. So now if you scroll down, you'll see the area that you're working with. And right now it's just a div without any styling. I want you to go ahead and write your CSS code below. Only write code that is going to target the grid container, which is this gray box around all of our grid items. And I want your code to make this purple section exactly the same as the green section and also responsive in exactly the same way. Pause the video, have a think about this problem, write your code, and then click Apply CSS to see it applied and make sure to see that you've got the right code working. Pause the video now and give that a go. All right, so the first thing we need to do in order to create a grid is, of course, set our display to grid, which is not going to do very much to our code, because we need to set the template. So we're going to use our grid template rows. Now, how should our rows look? Well, if we look at this first row, it seems to be as high as is required to fit the content. And similar with the second one, they're exactly the same height, but the third one seems to be double the size of these two. So we can use our fractional units with 1FR, 1FR, and 2FR to define our rows. Notice the third one is completely different from any of the other ones. If we look at the last row, you can see it's only 50 pixels high. So we could, if we wanted to define it right here as a fourth row. But I'm actually going to leave it because I'm going to use the grid auto rows to set the height for that last one instead. Let's go ahead and apply our CSS and see what happens. First row is 1FR, second row is 1FR, third row is twice as high. Now, what about all of these other ones? Well, we need them to become columns. So let's define our grid template columns. And it's really important that we don't make any typos here because otherwise our code is not going to work. If you have any strange errors or anything that's not working, I want you to make sure that you check the spelling of each of these grid template rows. Remember, there's an S at the end, and grid template columns. Make sure that you haven't spelled anything wrong because that happens a lot, and that's a really simple way to fix your problems. So how do we want our columns to be laid out? Well, this first one is going to expand to fill any available space. And even when it's hit the size of the content, it will continue to reduce until the minimum size. This is actually done using our auto value. So this is going to expand to fill any available space and shrink until it can no longer shrink. The second column is easy. It's a fixed 400 pixel wide column. And the final one has a minimum and maximum value, so it can be defined using our min-max function. Minimum 200 pixels and maximum 500 pixels. Let's create our three columns down here. Auto, 400 pixels, and then min-max, 200 and 500. Let's apply our CSS and we can see our purple ones are now looking pretty much the same as our green ones. And when we try to expand and contract our grid, you can see that it behaves exactly the same way in terms of responsiveness. For the final row, it's being put in with the height that is enough to fit its content. But remember, we learned about this concept of the grid auto row. So we could use grid auto rows. So again, we have an S at the end to define how high each new automatically created row that is outside of the template should be. So we can change that to 50 pixels. And when we apply that CSS, you can see that this, which is outside our template grid, gets added in with 50 pixels of height. Hopefully you managed to do this. If you didn't, go back and check to see if you have made any typos, any spelling mistakes, and with what we've spoken about in the solution, see if you can fix your code. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson where we're going to learn more about how to place items inside a CSS grid. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.